for joining us. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes and then I'll hand over. Welcome to Pelican House. Some of you might be here, have been here already or work here, but for those of you that don't know, it's a new office just there with 13 left groups working in it. So that's like TWT, Momentum, Rosa Lux, UVW, London Renters Union and others. And this is the adjoining event space, so hopefully this is the first of lots of events that you'll come to here. My name's Jamila, I'm from TWT, and I guess we've had a few requests from people that TWT is better on platforming issues to do with Ireland, Irish history and Irish struggles. We had a couple of events at our last festival in Brighton that did that, and are now doing this, and hopefully this will be the first of many events on the topic. And there's this archive over here that Mayday Rooms have really kindly put together. We're really hoping it will become a kind of travelling exhibition, with the first one being at our next festival in Liverpool and then so on around the country. We are raising funds tonight for that, so if you buy any drinks from the bar or any merch, or if you just want to chuck a few quid in the box over there, that will all go to making sure that this exhibition can grow and be platformed elsewhere. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I'll hand over to you now.
Hi everyone, I'm from an organisation called Mayday Rooms. We're an archive of radical social movements, and we've been working in collaboration with Maev and Jamila at TWT to start to build, to put this event on, but also to start to build a Troops Out movement archive at Mayday Rooms to go with our collection around post-68 Irish struggles. And we've put together a small showcase of some of the material from that archive at the back, with some audio that we've recorded with Aly, which kind of contextualises the Troops Out movement. Eventually we're going to build a big digital archive of this and put this online with accompanying kind of oral histories. So I also wanted to do a call out. I know there's lots of former Troops Out movement people here tonight. If anyone has any material that they would like to donate to the archive, or they don't have to actually give it to us, we can also just digitize it and give it back to you. We're not super precious about the original. So yeah, if you've got anything under your beds or in your wardrobes, which is usually where most archives are stored, then come and see me or Lukasz or Lamia, who are at the back, who also work for Mayday Rooms, and I'll hand it over to Maev now.
Hi, thank you so much everyone for being here. It's great to see lots of people here tonight. I think we wanted to keep it quite intimate, I think, because the spirit of today is an exchange and building a collection of sharing experiences. We particularly asked some people from different British left groups to attend today. Precisely, I think, because of my experience at the World Transformed just past. I was very lucky to be on a panel with Stevie and Chris Hazard to have a very serious kind of intervention about how the British left can engage with Irish struggles. But I was met with a lot of difficult kind of conversations where I was like the butt of the joke. I found it really jarring because I was finding myself in a position where I can make an effort and work with these groups, but it wasn't being reciprocated. So I thought, instead of being angry and frustrated, I've been working with the World Transformed in the Mayday Rooms in order to create a space for us to genuinely build a political education on Ireland, and that's kind of the spirit of today's event, as well as to celebrate this fantastic publication and to have that archive together. So I do want to thank the Mayday Rooms and the World Transformed. I think I knocked on the Mayday Rooms door in October and said, I have an idea, let's do this. So it's great to kind of have it coming together. And I'm delighted that we have 4 incredible speakers. Obviously only 3 of them are here so far. We have a placeholder for Jeremy. He's arriving at 8. He's got a vote in Parliament. So I've been living in England for almost 17 years, and if you had told me one of my best friends would be a former British soldier, I would have laughed at you, but here we are, and Aly Renwick, he's an absolute legend. I was very lucky to meet him through one of the Veterans for Peace guys. He's also a good friend of mine. Aly's an author and an activist, and he's one of the founding members of the Troops Out movement, and his meticulous kind of archive of the publications has just been so impressive. We also have the fabulous Shelly Asquith. Shelly is an absolutely tireless campaigner and actually just recently received an award for her work in solidarity with Palestine. Like, she's the chair of the Stop the War campaign, and she's always showed solidarity with Ireland. You know, she was speaking at the Bloody Sunday anniversary, and you know, from repeal to AIDS, whatever it is, Shelly's been a great comrade and friend. We also have the fabulous Stevie Nolan, and Stevie joins us from Trademark. He's come the whole way over from Belfast, so thank you. So, if you don't know much about Trademark, they're just a brilliant organisation committed to kind of ending workplace anti-sectarianism, and one of the legacies of the kind of Good Friday Agreement is that we have this entrenched kind of sectarianism where everything's framed in this narrative of Catholics versus Protestants, and you know, Stevie's kind of interventions across the workplaces and community groups have been really significant. And yeah, Jeremy, who will be joining us at 8, I think, you know, he obviously doesn't, it's so cliche, sorry, he obviously doesn't need an introduction, but I'm just going to go and hang my head in shame. But I think part of the reason that I personally wanted him here, and you know, as a group that we wanted him here, is he's one of very few British politicians who's held a brilliant and consistent line in solidarity with Ireland and Irish struggles. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to a good discussion. So we're going to get started with the fabulous Aly, if you want to kick us off. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, like Maev said, it's about 50 years now, and some of us are getting a little bit old. Now, I used to do speaking and I could just stand up there and do it, but I'm 77 now, so it's getting a bit more difficult. So I've had to write out my speech and I'll have to read it, so I hope you can bear with me on that. Now, I just want to put it into the context of the times when the Troops Out started and why we started it and all that sort of thing, because I think there will be people here who don't know much about the Troops Out movement, and you know, those are the people I'd probably mainly be trying to reach. In the weeks before British troops were sent out onto the streets of Derry in 1969, the #1 hit in the UK records charts was Something in the Air by Thunderclap Newman. This song was to ring out all the barricades in nationalist areas of Belfast and Derry, and its student sit-ins and worker struggles in Britain. Call out the instigators because there's something in the air. We've got to get it together sooner or later because the revolution's here. That's the sort of thinking that people had at that particular time. The Troops Out movement was started by people who were born around the end of the Second World War and who spent their formative years in the 60s. I'd entered that decade respecting and trusting the establishment and joined the British Army aged 16 in 1960. After experiencing Cold War North Atlantic Treaty Organisation manoeuvres in West Germany and Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation's operations in northeast Thailand during the height of the Vietnam War, I started to question the officer class and then the politicians at Westminster. Some of the things they said or did were to me absurd, and I began to laugh at them. But mainly I opposed their wars and wanted to see them replaced. I wasn't alone, however, because in Symmes Street I found there were so many others. As Britain had entered the 1960s, the country was emerging from a long period of rationing and austerity that had lasted from the end of the Second World War and from which the UK had emerged victorious, but also deeply in debt. To preserve their power and wealth post-war, the British establishment had set about squeezing every last drop of profits from the empire, while the British government used the armed forces to brutally crush anti-colonial revolts in places like Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus and Aden. In conventional warfare terms, a Cold War was being conducted against our deemed main enemy, the Russians, who ironically had been one of Britain's key allies a short time before against the Nazis. Nowadays, the 60s is often called the time of drugs, sex and rock and roll, and has been blamed by conservative politicians like Thatcher and Blair for all manner of problems in modern society. In fact, the decade was a contradictory period which saw a dramatic rise in consumerism after the post-World War II restrictions, but also a start to the decline of industry. It saw the rise of a counterculture and the spread of soulless high-rise tower blocks in concrete town centres. Gays were still prosecuted, as were the publishers of Lady Chatterley's Lover and anyone else who the establishment thought were out of line. Before the start of the welfare state and the National Health Service, the Education Act reforms of 1944 had ensured that a better educated generation would gradually emerge, who were determined to question and contest the values of their elders and betters. This is the main reason Conservatives still fear the 60s, because it was a time when the establishment's authority was challenged, and some of us started to see them as the enemy, rather than those they pointed their fingers at. Feminists and Greens appeared with the anti-nuclear peace movement, and we all merged to support the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and became anti-imperialist in opposition to the US war in Vietnam. As workers and student struggles erupted in Europe and across the world, in Derry and Belfast, civil rights protesters were being battened off their streets by the RUC, the local armed colonial-style police force, and its backup, the B Specials. The civil rights movement in the north of Ireland took its inspiration from the 60s radical upsurge in general, and the black struggle for civil rights in America in particular. And the period from August 1968 to 69 became a year of civil rights. But many of these peaceful protests were brutally attacked by the RUC. Towards the end of the 1960s, under the title of Land Operations, the British Army had rationalised its secret tactical manuals into a series of volumes. Volume 3, called Counter-Revolutionary Operations, was produced in August 1969 and drew together all the Army had learned post-World War II during the rundown of empire in its series of small wars in places like Malaya, Kenya, Cyprus and Aden. British troops had already been ordered to make ready for possible duty in the north of Ireland, and on Thursday, 14th August 1969, soldiers of the 1st Battalion, the Prince of Wales' Own, were sent out onto the streets of Derry. The left in Britain throughout the 60s had been busy concentrating on worker struggles, student agitation and anti-Vietnam War activities. But a few of us started to keep an eye on the worsening situation in the north of Ireland, and in 1969, to support the civil rights struggle, the Irish Civil Rights Solidarity Campaign was formed in Britain. In late 1971, as the struggle in Ireland escalated into conflict, internment without trial was introduced, and to protest against it, the Anti-Internment League emerged, first in the north of Ireland and then in Britain. Well, many British radicals helped to form and support the Irish Civil Rights Solidarity Campaign and the Anti-Internment League. Many of their members and most of their leaders and speakers, like Eamon McCann and Bernadette Devlin, were Irish. In early 1972, after British Army paratroopers in Derry had shot dead 13 peaceful protesters on Bloody Sunday, there were angry reactions across the world. The Irish in Britain were prominent in the protests and marches that flooded onto the streets, including a 30,000 strong demonstration in London organised by the Anti-Internment League. Police refused permission for 13 coffins to be carried into Downing Street, and clashes broke out when mounted police charged into the crowd. A number of people were injured and 122 demonstrators were arrested. Early the next morning, 3 Irish members of the Anti-Internment League Central Committee were arrested at their homes and charged with conspiring to countervene the Public Order Act of 1936. 2 ex-members of the Beatles, both from Liverpool and with an Irish grandparent each, protested in their own ways. In August 1971, John Lennon and Yoko Ono had joined an anti-internment march through London. Lennon displayed a red mole newspaper with its headline, "For the IRA Against British Imperialism," emblazoned across the front page. After the killings in Derry in 1972, Lennon wrote the songs "Sunday Bloody Sunday" and "The Luck of the Irish." That same year, Paul McCartney wrote "Give Ireland Back to the Irish." The record was banned by the BBC, but still made it to number 16 in the British charts. It was number 1 in Ireland and Spain. Many soldiers were now being killed and wounded, and British domestic opposition to the war began to rise. Peggy Chaston, the mother of a serving soldier, started a national petition calling for our boys to be brought home. The statement of a soldier who had fled to Sweden to escape serving in the north of Ireland was printed in Peace News. "I came to Sweden for asylum because of Northern Ireland. I do not think that what is happening there is very good. As I see it, there must be a simpler way of ending the fight without more people being killed. So I have left rather than fight in something I think is wrong." A few years later, the Labour Party had secretly considered a radical change to their policy on the north of Ireland, as Joe Haynes, Harold Wilson's then press secretary, stated. There were times, especially in the opposition years from 1970 to 74, when I believed that the next Labour government would take its courage to Parliament and announce that an orderly withdrawal was to take place. Courage it would certainly have needed, for withdrawal was as unmentionable in Whitehall and Westminster as devaluation had been. Even when we did mention it privately in the irresponsibility of opposition, we only did so under the code name of Algeria. Rather ironic. Ironically, by the middle of 1973, there had been a downturn of work on the north of Ireland by the radical groups who were concentrating on the industrial struggle in Britain, which were to bring about the 3-day week, a miners' strike, and the end of the Heath Conservative government in early 1974. I'd been a member of the Irish Civil Rights Solidarity Campaign and was still a member of the Anti-Internment League, which was now more or less on its last legs. So in August 1973, I became part of a small group of anti-imperialist activists who began to meet regularly in West London to plan the forming of a new organisation, one which would be keyed into the increasing dissent about the aggressive use of British troops in the north of Ireland, and also, like the anti-Vietnam War movement in the US, the concern about their mounting casualties. We decided to call the new organisation the Troops Out Movement, and to give ourselves a firm anti-imperialist base, we adopted Troops Out Now, based on self-determination for the Irish people as a whole, as our two demands. The Troops Out Movement's first bulletin, Tom Tom, stated, the Troops Out Movement was formed in West London in September 1973 by a group of trade unionists, housewives, students and ex-soldiers. Unlike the Irish Civil Rights Solidarity Campaign, the Anti-Internment League, which had mainly shown the Irish face of protest in Britain, we wanted the Troops Out Movement's main focus to be that of British people protesting about the use of their own troops in Ireland. We knew there was a long and honourable tradition in Britain of anti-imperialist opposition to the colonial wars and the military occupation of Ireland. This went back as far as the English Civil War of 1642 to 51. When some Leveller soldiers mutinied rather than go with Cromwell's army to Ireland, they were arrested and 3 were executed at Burford Church near Oxford. Before that, the Levellers had produced the document Representation, which asked questions about Oliver Cromwell's proposed reconquest of Ireland. Whether those who pretend for freedom, as the English now, shall not make themselves altogether inexcusable in entrenching upon others' freedoms, and whether it be not the character of a true patriot to endeavour the just freedom of all men as well as his own. 2 centuries later, Karl Marx had been a critic of British rule in Ireland, and in 1870 he'd observed that Ireland is the only excuse of the English government for maintaining a big standing army, which in case of need they send against the English workers, as has happened after the army became turned into Praetorians in Ireland. Marx meant this as a warning, and his words were later shortened into, a nation that oppresses another forges its own chains. A century later in Britain, we saw evidence of Marx's warning coming true again. During the miners' strike in 1984, police from various areas of the country were organised as a militia against the strikers, in a modified form of what was already occurring in the north of Ireland. Many of the security services' other covert procedures from Belfast and Derry were also used, like surveillance, phone tapping, and the use of agents, informers, and provocateurs. This, combined with the media smearing the strikers and the justice system criminalising them, helped to ensure the downfall of the miners. The mine workers' paper, The Miner, acknowledged this when reporting the happenings in a mining village. For a period, Blidworth resembled not a mining village in the heart of Notts, but the bloodied, oppressive streets of Belfast. At the time of its inception, the Troops Out Movement had taken its inspiration and methods from the anti-Vietnam War protest in the US. So we set about mobilising opposition to the UK government's use of military force in the north of Ireland, and we warned that similar methods would be used against British workers. During its decade of campaigning, the Troops Out Movement can be compared to the more recent Stop the War coalition, set up in 2001 in Britain after the US President George W. Bush had announced his war on terror. Organised as broadly based movements, TOM and Stop the War had an affiliation of local and national groups and individuals. They both undermined the propaganda of the UK government and military. They both showed concern for the welfare of individual soldiers and provided a platform for dissident military personnel. They both encouraged and drew out dissident opinion by building and highlighting the widespread opposition in Britain to the conflict and the lack of peace talks. Over 3 decades, the Troops Out movement organised regular yearly visits to the north of Ireland that built lasting links with those subjected to daily contact with British troops. Throughout those years, against the backdrop of the war, a bombing campaign in Britain, attacks on our demonstrations by the far right, state harassment and state agents sent to infiltrate TOM, we sought to keep the withdrawal of British troops at the forefront of local and national politics. We also campaigned against plastic bullets, no jury courts and the H-blocks, and for free speech, prisoners' rights, and in support of the hunger strikers. National demonstrations in London and other big cities combined with local meetings, leafleting, petitions and pickets of army recruitment offices strengthened the roots of the organisation. During the time of conflict in the north of Ireland, opinion polls consistently showed a majority of British people wanting to see the withdrawal of their troops. In 1984, for example, a report on British social attitudes published by the independent academic Institute Social and Community Planning Research found 58% in favour of the reunification of Ireland and a majority wanting the withdrawal of troops from the north. While people were willing to express this view in private, many were not willing to support it in public. It is difficult now for anyone to realise how hard it was then to explain the nationalist case, criticise the government, or even suggest that talk should take place. Anyone who did so was liable to be identified and vilified in the media. And Ken Livingstone, who spoke out over many years, was constantly denigrated in the right-wing papers. But Ken was not alone. 3 other London Labour MPs, John McDonnell, Diane Abbott and Jeremy Corbyn, also helped Tom and spoke on our platforms, despite the treatment dished out to them by the media. The Troops Out movement, by openly campaigning for a British withdrawal, helped keep this issue in the minds of the public and therefore also kept it as a part of the political agenda. Tom also helped to make it acceptable for people to express their wish to say an end to the partition of Ireland and look forward to a united Ireland in the future. And of course this is work that's still ongoing and we should all get involved in that. In those early days in August 1969, after an annual Orange March in Derry, the RUC and B specials had tried to force their way into the nationalist Bogside area, but were met by determined resistance from the local people. After 2 days of street fighting, the demoralised RUC and B specials were withdrawn and replaced by British soldiers. There was now a brief honeymoon period between the soldiers and the nationalists, who had regarded the entry of the troops as a victory over the Unionist government at Stormont and their anti-Catholic state and repressive police. The scene was set for a solution or further violent clashes. By deciding to back the Unionist status quo, Westminster chose the latter, which was to lead to over 3 decades of armed conflict. As the establishment started gunning for Irish rebels again in the north of Ireland, they continued their Cold War with Russia too. Inside Britain, they also sought out what they called the enemy within, which to them included militant trade unionists, protesters, instigators and troublemakers of every kind. After the discredited RUC was withdrawn from use to be retrained and rearmed, the soldiers became the British state's only force for law and order in the north of Ireland. Using land operations as their blueprint, with its sections on the threat and principles for the conduct of counter-revolutionary operations, and details of high psychological operations, military actions and political initiatives must be coordinated, they set to work. Under commanders like Brigadier Frank Kitson, all of this was soon being acted out on the streets in Belfast and Derry. So given carte blanche by Westminster and egged on by the Unionists in Stormont, the army gradually embarked on a series of aggressive operations. These actions, which included the Falls Curfew in 1970, internment in 1971, and Bloody Sunday and Operation Motorman in 1972, quickly turned Northern Ireland into a zone of ongoing conflict. These hostile acts, however, did not cow the nationalists, but instead only bred a violent resistance. The Sunday Times Insight team reported what happened after the Falls Curfew. In the months that followed, recruitment to the provisionals was dizzily fast. The movement grew from fewer than 100 activists in May-June to nearly 800 by December. In those early days, militants in the north of Ireland and those who stood in solidarity with them in Britain knew that what we faced would not be an easy struggle, because we knew that behind closed doors the ruling class were striving to maintain their power and control and had already begun to put their plans into action. At that time in Britain, we were concerned but not afraid, because the 60s had spawned a layer of political activists who in radical politics had found a vision more addictive than drugs, more passionate than sex, and more potent than rock and roll. And the troops of that movement were determined to stay the course, which we did. And when we look back on it, we remember those early days as heady times when there was something in the air. And I'll just finish by saying, this is a struggle that hasn't ended. You know, the agreement that was made produced a political situation where the struggle could go forward on a political basis. But that struggle has got to go. And I remember just a little while ago we heard that Boris Johnson saying that he was asking historians to bring out a new narrative on the North. So we know the physical war might have ended, but the propaganda war still continues, and we all need to take part, against the forces of reaction on that. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Aly. I think bringing us to the present day, I think particularly because these images are so iconic, and they're used and almost we can't look at what happened then without considering the conditions today. And as Stevie is Belfast based and organises in the 6 counties, I think that's a nice segue into kind of talking about, well, what you're going to talk about.
I've got a couple of years on Aly, so I'm going to stand up. Only a couple now. I can't talk and sit down to an audience, it's just against my principles. Thanks very much, Goran. Maev McDaid, and you. Thanks very much for the invitation to be here today. It's always nice to get back to London for a couple of days, but a couple of days normally does it for me now. I've been away a long time. I wanted to say thank you to Jeremy, actually. It's a pity he's not here, because last year he made a really nice video tribute for my best mate and a very close comrade of ours, Mel Corrie, who works in Trademark, who died of COVID last January. And it was a lovely thing for him to do. And it speaks to that idea that we don't always recognise the hard work and the heavy lifting that activists in our movement do, and they don't get the recognition they deserve. And so that was lovely. But also it speaks to the idea of an archive, because archives in some way speak to that legacy of the hard work and the heavy lifting that the activists do, activists like Aly and other people who are here from the Troops Out movement, and they really get the recognition they deserve. And so it's a pleasure and an honour to be invited here today to be sitting on the same panel with you. I was on many of those marches, by the way, back in the late 70s and early 80s, usually running from the peelers, or the cops as we called them in them days. In terms of the title of the Lessons for the British Left, I'm like, how long have we got? We could be here for some time, let me tell you, because apart from the odd exception, and he's here, and others, of course, who are here, the British Left traditionally have been a bit shit on Ireland, to be frank, to be honest about it. And it's not just a historical problem, it's an ongoing problem, it's an ongoing issue that we face. I sometimes think that when activists from here look west, they just see New York. And that kind of troublesome little rock battered by Atlantic waves just disappears beneath them, or it's passed over, here be dragons, best avoided. And there's a real myopia on parts of the British left about Ireland, where there isn't on other places, and that's the key thing, which is surprising considering what the Northern Ireland Tourist Board calls our 800 years of shared history, as if it's just a bit of crack, like, just a bit of a laugh. And I know that you'll want evidence, and I know that's a terrible slur on the British left, and I know you want me to give you like peer-reviewed articles, but I'm a trade union activist, so I don't do that, I just do anecdotes, so that's what you're going to get. But when the anecdotes are plenty enough, they add up to good research, that's what I'm going with. And my favourite one is the one, it's happened on, I don't know how many times, maybe 10 times over the last 30 years, and it happened last summer. We had a delegation over from London actually, of a young group of leftists. They were sound, they were very well educated, they were very active, and one of them sidled up to me and says, "Steve, can I ask you a question?" He goes, "Of course, mate, what is it?" He goes, "Who exactly was James Connolly?" So I just sat him down. I said, "Well, look, in a pantheon of Irish national leaders, he's kind of at the top, which is really good for us on the left, because he was a Republican socialist, a trade unionist, a Marxist, a revolutionary, co-founder of the Irish Citizen Army, what Lenin called the first Red Army to take to the streets of Europe. So we fucking love Connolly, and the establishment would love to get rid of him, but he's kind of dug in like a tick in the Irish psyche, in the national psyche." And the lad was very polite, so thanks very much. But in my head, there was a different conversation going on. I was going, "Fuck me! How did you not fucking know who James Connolly is?" I mean, imagine going up to a South African and saying, "There was a geezer, black geezer, Nelson something. What's this?" Or going up to anyone from Latin America and saying, "There was an Argentinian doctor, rode motorbikes." It simply wouldn't happen, and you know it wouldn't happen. And there's a real block, there's a real blank when it comes to Ireland. And I know that Ireland's difficult at times, not least because of the troubles and facing the stark realities of that conflict and the legacy of that conflict, and people are afraid to talk about it sometimes, particularly over here, because they're afraid of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing, and we're quick to jump down your throat, which we do, by the way, so I understand that, but there's something deeper as well, and it's because of the history of the British left. That's the reality of it as well, because, and I know there's exceptions to that rule, but the history of the British left is one where it kind of grew in the heart, the metropolitan centre really of empire, you know, and that changes the nature of that left. When you're on the periphery of empire, the socialism that grows there is different. Why? Because it has a distinctly anti-imperialist character, and that matters, and I don't think people recognise that enough here sometimes. And apart from that golden thread that Ali spoke about so well, there's that tradition that in the British left that there's a reason why that golden thread has never weaved anything more substantial, and it's imperialism. And that has to be faced up to and recognised here. It's never been more important than it is today, even, in terms of the silencing of anti-war and anti-militarist and anti-imperialist voices, again, when the West wants to go to war. And the thing about the heart of empire is that, as Maev said, it can ignore the periphery. It doesn't need to understand the periphery. It's not always willful ignorance, it's just that there's an awful lot to be getting on with, isn't there? There's a lot of countries, a lot of histories, a lot of national liberation movements to deal with. But see, when you're in the periphery, you understand the centre really, really well. You know it really well. Why? Because every day you're assaulted by its power, by its culture, by its army, by its language. I should be able to stand here today and speak in Irish. There should be translation facilities. Some of you might even be able to understand me. I mean, how is it possible that you could know fucking nothing about the native language of your nearest neighbour? Well, there's answers to those questions, and again, it's imperialism. And unfortunately, for most of its history, the British left has sided with the interests of imperialism. And again, we're seeing it once again, as we're seeing right now. And we have to face up to that and have conversations about it. I was doing a bit of research for that talk at TWT in September, and I don't know much about the history of the British labour movement, so I was doing a bit of research, and I came across this thing called the Colonial Bureau of the Fabian Society. And I thought, well, this would be interesting. Maybe this is an early example of the British left taking an anti-imperialist stance. I didn't know what the fuck it was, in my naivety. You know, imagine my surprise when I discovered that the Colonial Bureau of the Fabian Society, 1940s it was, they wanted to produce research on how better to manage the empire. And they were strongly in support of the maintenance of that stain on the world, which is what the British Empire was. Let's be quite honest about it. And when it comes to Ireland, I think the left often falls into the trap, a well-laid trap, I have to say, of understanding the so-called Irish question as some sort of internal Irish problem, you know, these warring, ancient, tribal kind of antagonisms, without recognising, actually ignoring completely the idea that British imperialism, you know, created and maintained those antagonisms, because it suits them to do that. I mean, even after the Act of Union in 1801, when Ireland became part of the United Kingdom, it was still treated like an internal colony. And how do we know that? Well, it was ruled by the Colonial Office, not by the Home Office, which looked after Wales and Scotland. And in that same period, there were, I don't know, 105 different coercion acts to give additional state powers in Ireland to suppress rebellion and repress discontent. Why? because Ireland never accepted English Crown rule or British rule. It was always resisted. And whenever it was subverted or crushed, it always happened without the support of the British left, broadly speaking. I mean, in 1916, I know you'll know this story, but it still shocks me when I say it. Whenever the news of the execution of James Connolly came through to the British Houses of Parliament, the Labour Party stood and applauded.
Shame.
And after partition and the treaty, the Labour Party supported it. They kind of went a long way to supporting partition and the treaty. And the low point perhaps came in the summer of 1920 when about 6,000 or 7,000 workers were violently expelled from the shipyards in Belfast, Catholics and left-wing radical communist and trade union Protestants. The Labour Party said nothing and the TUC said nothing. I mean, that's where we are. And you get the impression after that in the 20s that the Labour Party were just happy that the Irish question would just go away. Out of sight, out of mind. And so they established a convention in Westminster that they wouldn't talk about Northern Ireland matters in the Houses of Parliament. So it wouldn't even be discussed there. And of course, eventually the dam breaks, 1969. And who sends the troops in? The Labour Party. 1974 Anti-Terrorism Act. The Labour Party. The policies of normalisation, of criminalisation, of Ulsterisation. The Labour Party. And Ulsterisation particularly, you know what it's about. It was bad that there was English, Scots and Welsh lads getting killed in Northern Ireland. So I'll tell you what we'll do, we'll recruit local Brits. We'll get them to do the dying. I mean, a more cynical policy you couldn't fucking find. And straight out of the colonial playbook that you refer to, the Kitson playbook. Again, Labour Party did that. Now you could argue, I think in the early 80s there was a period when Labour had an Irish unity policy, very briefly. It was kind of the policy for opposition. Lasted a couple of years, but then it was dumped very quickly. And after that, you could, and many people will argue that getting the Good Friday Agreement over the line somehow redeems the Labour Party. We can have that debate because it was, and we supported it in the Irish Labour movement, and many Socialist Republicans supported it, of course. But it wasn't the end of a process; it was the beginning, as you said rightly, of a new process. But the British left, well, that's it. We've done now, but it's not. We still have that battle to fight. And that period, I think, is really important. That attitude that the Labour Party had during the 20s and 30s and 40s is really crucial because when it took that decision just to take its eye off Northern Ireland and hand it over Northern Ireland to a group of Northern Unionists, I mean, they managed that place accordingly. It was a place born into violence, sectarianism was institutionalised, the Ulster Volunteer Force became the Special Ulster Constabulary, an armed ethno-nationalist militia within the United Kingdom. They had the Special Powers Act. I think it was Vorster, was it, the South African Justice Minister in 1963, who was designing a coercion act for apartheid South Africa. And he said, I'll give up all of this legislation for one clause of the Northern Ireland Special Powers Act. Yeah. Such was its reach and such was its brutality on the local population. And all of that, of course, sanctioned by the British state, paid for by the British state. Now, 24 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and we're in a different place, of course, and as Ali rightly said, that wasn't a full stop, it was the beginning of a different kind of process. But you would think, when you talk to leftists here, that it was just a full stop, and nothing happened since. And we have to kind of re-engage, I think, our heads and our hearts in the debate about Ireland and what happens next. And the relationships changed dramatically. I mean, Britain's no longer a world power, someone should tell them that. But it doesn't have an empire anymore. And the relationship with Ireland is different, and the relationship with the North is different. I mean, at one point, you could argue just about that the North may have been considered a strategic imperial asset. Over the last 30 years, it's moved to a position of relative kind of neutrality, really. I think was it Patrick Mayhew who said we have no strategic, military or economic interest. So now, actually, one of Northern Ireland is considered a bit of a burden and an inconvenience. What did Dominic Cummings say 18 months ago? Is I couldn't care less if Northern Ireland falls into the fucking sea. That was music to my ears. Because that's the true voice of the British establishment, or part of the British establishment, at least, are seeking out. And that's where we are. So what's the role of the British left in that context? What is it supposed to do now? And I suppose, well, one thing it's not supposed to do is campaign for the maintenance of the fucking union, which I heard recently from a leader of some party or other. What it's supposed to do is what it always should have done, which is to unequivocally support the peaceful achievement of a united, independent and sovereign Ireland. And then it's our job to turn it into a socialist republic. All right? I'll leave that briefing there.
Thank you so much, Stevie. Shelly, are you happy to?
Yeah. So like Stevie, I'm going to stand up, but like Ali, I've printed out my speech. It is an honour to be part of this event tonight, and particularly to follow really informative and inspiring contributions from Stevie and Ali. But I'm going to talk a bit about the British anti-war movement today, but I want to start by paying tribute to Maev for bringing this event together tonight, and for playing an important part in the retelling of this history. And for me personally, this proud Derry woman has, she's taught me so much, not just about the struggle of the Irish people, but about solidarity itself, and not just what it means to say it and declare it, but to possess it and to demonstrate it and to live by it. So credit to Maev. While we campaign in opposition to the wars being waged today, 50 years on, many of these demands for justice obviously remain, and because we're yet to see justice for Bloody Sunday, we're yet to see justice for Ballymurphy, and justice for all those brutalised by British forces in Ireland. And too many British people were yet to know and clearly understand the history, the struggle and the consequences of colonisation. I'm really grateful to Ali for compiling this collection, obviously in all your activism as well, but bringing this together, and credit to Mayday Rooms and the World Transformed as well for giving it a space to be seen, so it can be accessed and learned from. And so that we might go forward as well and ensure that future generations do know and understand how this remains a living struggle today. It can't only be left to second generation Irish folk to pass that on, but the Brits among us and those from wherever else as well have a duty to do that too. As Maev mentioned, I'm from the Stop the War Coalition, which, as Ali said, was founded 21 years ago this year. So the Troops Out movement obviously predates our organisation, and naturally we draw inspiration from it. We share a political strategy of sorts. It's mine and it's our view of Stop the War that, as anti-war activists in Britain, we've the most leverage when putting demands on our own government. Of course, we take interest and we take issue with actions of other governments abroad, but we make the focus of our work the opposition to the British state's involvement in and support for war and militarism, be it direct deployment or be it the supplying of arms, of political support and its consequences, including the racism that so often goes with it. We also stand in solidarity with people elsewhere in the world fighting their own government's war on terror and the horrors of imperialism, wherever that may be. Something that Tony Benn, who was president of the Stop the War Coalition, something he said when he was making a speech, making the case for the withdrawal of British troops in Ireland. He said, one of the things missing in modern British politics is the radical tradition that goes back to before the birth of socialism, the opposition to militarism, the opposition to imperialism. I think that's absolutely true today as well. We've a way to go before anti-imperialism is seen as a common sense position, even among some sections of the left, I'm afraid to say. That is why I spend time trying to build the anti-war movement, and that's why I hope other, including younger, people do the same. Because what is the state of play today, 50 years on, it is a time of increasing alarm. This week marks the 7th anniversary of the brutal Saudi-led war on Yemen, hence the attire tonight. And Britain is now the biggest supplier of weapons to Saudi Arabia. It is British bombs that are raining down on Yemen, home to the world's worst humanitarian crisis today. And on top of that, Britain is currently investing $16.5 billion in defence spending, the largest boost in military spending in 30 years. On top of that, we last year had Britain's Carrier Strike Group mission to the Indo-Pacific, the first battle fleet in Asia since the Korean War in the 50s, including the largest warship Britain has ever sent to sea. And it was only 6 months ago that troops were pulled out of Afghanistan. The 20-year-long war in Afghanistan was, for my generation, it has lasted most of our lifetimes. We came of age against the backdrop of the war on terror. Those who opposed intervention at the time, the millions who marched in the streets, warned of the exact consequences, warned that you can't impose a regime on people through military occupation, warned that this would make Afghanistan and the world less, not more safe, that it would fuel hatred for the West and strengthen the support for the Taliban, that it would create the conditions for racism and terrorism, and that it would cause a massive refugee crisis. On all of which counts, we were sadly proved right. We also grew up with the Islamophobia being normalised in our media and in our politics. Britain was at war against extremists, terrorists, fundamentalists. Sounds familiar. And I know there are clear parallels with the way in which Irish Republicans were treated in my parents' generation, in the generations before that. The Afghanistan deployment was only half as long as the deployment to Ireland, the longest in British military history. And the longer the occupation, the greater the damage done, not just structurally, but psychologically as well. And we know the Troops Out movement was attacked, harassed, deeply infiltrated. And the anti-war movement in Britain is still attacked now. For the various positions that we take, you only have to look at the rather hysterical way in which some sections of the establishment jump to paint us as the enemies at the moment. We condemn Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, but there is a keenness to ignore it and to even attempt to spin it as if the opposite were true at the moment. It's our critical stance of the NATO military alliance and its bloody record around the world that has caused us recent condemnation. And indeed, the anti-war movement in Britain, as elsewhere, is attacked on a daily basis for an even longer standing position, for continuing to call for an end to our government's support for Israel's violent occupation and denial of justice to the Palestinian people, a people I know many in Ireland, especially in the north, especially Maev, hold a deep and unwavering solidarity with. I think it's important to remember how deep that demonisation of the anti-war movement goes. It's not just sections of the establishment and the media running very public smear campaigns. I was personally victim to that for working with former British detainees at Guantanamo, labelled a terrorist sympathiser. But as years have gone on, I've witnessed just how deep that state operation goes. It's perhaps maybe more blatant these days. It was recently brought to light that some training material used in counter-terrorism policing, which was leaked, provided trainee officers with a series of logos to look out for when considering signs that someone may have been or is becoming radicalised by extremists. So there's a page featuring logos of neo-Nazis and fascist organisations. Then there was another page for left-wing organisations to look out for, among them the Stop the War Coalition, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. These materials, it was later revealed, were not just used in policing, but made available to all sorts of public sector workers, in the NHS, in education, part of their preventing violent extremism training. Look out for those nasty peace campaigners who are radicalising your children, your patients and your colleagues. Not only are people being taught nothing of the violence of the British state historically or today in the education system, but actually often people, and young people especially, are being instead taught to actively fear those whose mission it is to expose it and oppose it. So we know that our task is not an easy one. We know that we remain up against it, and it makes it all the more worthwhile that we do draw lessons from movements from the past to inform and inspire our work today. Abroad, our government has supported and waged wars that have left thousands of people, civilians, dead, thousands more displaced, injured and traumatised as a result. And at home as well, the violence of the British state rages on. We know now that the north of Ireland became a testing ground, as Aly referred to earlier, for military activity and repression, with army officers openly admitting that soldiers would be sent to Ireland to learn what to do when they came back to Britain. Learn what to do when they got to the picket lines of the miners' strike, for example. The British state has not become more tame, be it the tactics of the border agency allowing deaths in the Channel, or the deportation of refugees who do make it here, be it the police overseeing hundreds of black deaths in custody, be it the victims of Orgreave, Hillsborough, Grenfell, the Windrush scandal, and all other victims of British state violence. The fight for truth and the search for justice is not over. We now currently face a strengthening of state powers as well with the Spy Cops Bill, the Overseas Operations Bill being brought through Parliament. They will give a green light to serious crimes if undertaken by agents of the British state. So we must increase our activity and build our resistance to them, preventing future injustices and fighting for those still ongoing, in a movement that must not be just anti-war and anti-militarism, but for abolition, for racial justice, for peace. In our lifetime, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shelly, and welcome, Jeremy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Sorry, it's kind of in and out because unlike my parliamentary colleagues here who don't need to get back, I'm going to go over to vote on the Health and Social Care Bill, so I'm sorry that sort of interfered with the arrangements today. And the other thing I'd say is that John McDonnell cannot be here tonight because he's got a very important education event on, but he sends his greetings and solidarity to everyone here, and I'm sure you would welcome that, because John has been a fantastic campaigner on Ireland for so long and so shown such solidarity. And seeing these reproductions and originals of the Troops Out movement, I understand through World Transforming yourselves you're collecting more of them, is that correct?
Yeah.
So if I dig through my copious archives...
Under the bed, in the cupboard, everywhere.
It's better organised than that. I'll see what I've got. I may well have some stuff, and it's also very likely that Islington Borough Archives, who are very good at collecting stuff, may well have material as well. It's worth asking them about it because they've been very good at collecting various bits of political propaganda over many, many years. So but I think it's important that people understand the complexities of anything to do with Ireland in British politics. And I was obviously very young when the Troubles began, in the sense of the explosion of the unrest in Ireland at that time, and when the troops went in, and I just remember like it was yesterday seeing on a very small black and white television James Callaghan speaking to people from the upstairs window of a house about why British troops had come. And at that point there was sort of debate about it, I suppose you'd say, in Ireland. And then when Bloody Sunday happened, everything absolutely changed, and I remember the whole Bloody Sunday event, obviously, and the following Saturday we had a march from Kilburn to Trafalgar Square, which was a very long way to march, and we carried 13 coffins, and then the police decided to prevent us going down Whitehall where we wanted to go, and a whole lot of us were arrested as a result of that. And I was one of those that was arrested. I was accused of assaulting a police officer and found guilty almost summarily. And we then had a very big meeting at the Irish Centre in Camden, and there was sort of everyone who'd been arrested was there, and there was various volunteers got together, and the idea was you sort of queued up to be allocated your barrister for your appeal. So I get in the queue and I get there and I say, oh yeah, there's this fellow here, what's his name? Oh yeah, Mansfield, this guy Mansfield, he'll represent you. Michael Mansfield wasn't quite the household name he is now then. So when we got to court, Michael Mansfield, wow. This young man, with his whole life ahead of him, will be destroyed on the dishonesty and lies of the police officers over there. Your Honour, how could this case possibly proceed? And that was just the opening line. And we won. So well done, Michael. It was quite incredible. And so there were high points and low points in it, but the horror of what was happening in Northern Ireland and the anti-Irish activities of the British media and so on. And when later on a group of us from Islington went to picket the offices of the Sun about them displaying anti-Irish racism in their paper. And so a group of us went and picketed the offices of the Sun, which it wasn't the greatest day I've ever had. And then we went in to meet the editor of the Sun, and he said, well, it sells papers. I said, hang on, it's just plain wrong, isn't it? He says, yeah, maybe, but it does sell papers, you know. I said, well, we're going to boycott the Sun. I mean, I never bought the Sun in real life, actually. So it didn't amount to very much. But these sort of gestures were all quite important to stand up against what was going on, the denigration of Irish people, Irish history and the Irish community. And the brutality of the Supergrass trials, of Diplock courts, and all that went on, and of course the imprisonment of an awful lot of people. And I was very involved in the Guildford 4 and Birmingham 6 campaigns. Now they're all sort of recorded now as being a great success for liberty in this country, and they were. And well done Chris Mullin on winning his case when the West Midlands Police tried to make him reveal the notes of his investigations all those years ago into the Birmingham 6. So I think full support for Chris in achieving that. But there wasn't a lot of support. It was very isolating, and I've never forgotten going to Worthing in Sussex to do a public meeting in support of the Guildford 4. And there were 5 of us there speaking, plus a chair. So there were 6 on the platform. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. This platform plus 1. Great. There were 4 people in the audience. So we outnumbered the audience. So we duly gave fantastic speeches to the 4 of them on the front row. And they turned out to be friends of one of the speakers anyway. So it wasn't all easy, but it was very important to do it. And the sense of hurt and damage done to the individuals in prison, the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4, and I visited all of them many times in prison, and I got to know all the prisons of the country, because there was also, the prison authorities were quite good at moving prisoners the night before you were due to have a visit. So I would make arrangements to visit Paul Hill somewhere, and then go to the prison. Oh, sorry, he was moved last night. Oh, that's an interesting coincidence. And this visit was confirmed yesterday morning. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it was that sort of thing, just designed to wind you up the whole time. But those campaigns were very, very important. And then all the demands about justice and the cover-up of the Widger inquiry into Bloody Sunday, and then the demands made by so many people, which ended up with the Savile inquiry, and then the David Cameron apology, and then to me the 50th anniversary in Derry was in January was quite an amazing time for me. I was very honoured to be invited to give that talk, and also the sense of pride that people had in what they had achieved in standing up, the museum, the demonstrations. And what to me was most interesting was talking to young people in Derry who have a completely different perception of their future and what they want to achieve in life and society. And I used that as a way of starting to explore the future, the possibilities of all United Ireland, but above all that understanding of the broad swathe of Irish history, because I went to school in England, and I'll give an example of how Irish history was taught. We got on to the famine. It was immediately called a potato famine, and it was apparently caused by farmers not knowing how to grow potatoes. We taught this utter nonsense of Irish history, which didn't talk about the brutality of the occupation, of the famine, of the numbers of people that were forced to emigrate, of the poverty, or of the fact that during the famine, food was being exported from Ireland at the same time. The whole thing was contrived. And there's so much else on Irish history, and recently read a brilliant biography or history of the life of James Connolly as part of the 16 books that have been produced. Quite extraordinary. And you think of the bravery and intellect, intelligence and history of Connolly. A man who had no education, who taught himself, a man who with incredible vision, knowledge, and everything he could have contributed later in his life, executed in a chair because he was so injured he couldn't even stand at that time. I think people need to understand this about the history of Ireland, because if we don't understand history, we'll never know where we're going. But it also means learning the lessons of standing up against injustice, however popular or unpopular it makes you. And just back to the points of the Guildford Four, I just remember like it was yesterday when I first got involved in the Guildford Four campaign. And as soon as this thing became public, this was pre-internet times, I could paper the walls of my house with the abusive letters I received. Oh, loads of them. Death threats, this, that, and the other. A bit like normal, really. And yet, in the end, we won through. In the end, we won through because of the strength of the Irish community who've made such a massive contribution to this city, to this country, to people, and to the world as a whole. And we won through by that. But it means you've got to keep on relating the same stories over and over again to the next generation, the generation after that. Otherwise, things start to go backwards. And so we look for justice, and I hope as justice comes for the Craigavon too as well. And so, because there are still issues going on that have got to be addressed and got to be dealt with. But remembering what it was like, remembering the campaigns, remembering all those that sadly lost everything, and go forward for a peace which is an understanding, and a peace which is a genuine one, which gives real opportunities to the next generation. And for those that don't necessarily relate to all of what Northern Ireland was like in the 60s and 70s, I remember coming to London in the mid-60s for a CND demonstration. I was given a leaflet about election rigging in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. It was something printed on a Gestetner, so I related to it immediately as being I was a demon printer on Gestetners of all kinds of things. And this was just describing the corruption of the whole way that Northern Ireland's politics had developed and gone on. And so that is that sort of thing that you have to understand, that we need to make sure our next generation absolutely understand that history. And so tonight we're remembering the Troops Out movement for all that they did, the Troops Out movement for raising difficult questions, getting a lot of abuse and a lot of attacks at the time, but ultimately British troops were withdrawn. Prevention of Terrorism Act was repealed. The Savile Inquiry did completely exonerate all those that were in Derry on that terrible day in 1972. If we'd shut up, gone away, said nothing, done nothing, nothing, but nothing would have ever changed. Thank you very much.